Welcome to this week's episode of Tree Lady Talks.
What's the word again, Dad?
It's bark, you imbecile.
I can't say it.
Oh, God.
All right, you don't have to rub it in.
Well, I know a lot of you are dog lovers and dog owners, and so are we. You would have heard us talk about Compo and Barney, the golden retrievers. So I am absolutely delighted to be interviewing Zazie Todd today, who is an animal behaviour expert, an award-winning author. And I'm here today to talk to her about her third book, Bark, How to Deal with Your Anxious, Fearful or Reactive Dog. Zazie, thanks for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for having me on the show.
Well, Zazie, so many of our dogs are anxious or seem to be a problem. But tell us, what is science teaching us about how to work with our fearful dogs?
It's actually teaching us that there's a lot that we can do to help, and that's why I wanted to write this book, to bring hope to people with fearful, anxious and reactive dogs, because it can feel so hard having a fearful dog. And actually, unfortunately, a rather large number of dogs have some kind of fear and anxiety, up to 3/4 according to one study. But there's a lot that we can do, and it basically centers on helping the dog to feel safe and finding ways in which we can teach them that actually they can even love the thing that they were previously afraid of.
I really love that. And the book goes through worked examples, which we'll discuss later. But can I just say that I was so relieved when I started to read this book, because the old doctrine was you should be dominant, you are the master, and you need to tell your dog off, and it has to be kept maybe in a kennel or downstairs. But what does science say about that?
It's good news, because all of that is completely outdated now. The bad news part is that, unfortunately, using those outdated doctrines and ideas is harmful to our dogs, or it can be harmful to our dogs. So it's not about being the pack leader or being dominant or telling your dog off. And the other harmful thing that people used to say is they used to tell you not to comfort your dog if they were afraid. And science now tells us you absolutely should be comforting your dog if they want to be comforted. It will potentially help them, and it certainly will help the human-animal bond. And if you're not doing it, it's kind of, you're not fulfilling your duty as the dog's guardian in a way, basically. So that's really important, to put all of these old, outdated ideas behind us and forget about them, and learn that really it's about meeting the dog's needs. And once you know what your dog needs and you provide for those needs, you're going to have a much happier dog, and that in turn will help to make you happier, and you'll have a much better relationship with your dog too.
I mean, let's think about this. So our dogs sleep on the sofa a lot of the time. Lots of people have their dogs on the bed. In fact, we used to have Compo on the bed when we first had him, but he grew really large and had a problem with his elbows, so he doesn't sleep on our bed anymore. But there is, oh no, you shouldn't be doing this. But I also think you wouldn't do this to a child, would you? You wouldn't ignore a child who was afraid, or tell a child off who was scared, would you? So I think there's a lot to be learned from that.
I think there is. And if you go back far enough, people would have told children off in those circumstances, and they learned that you shouldn't. And so we're needing people with dogs to kind of catch up, and that you shouldn't be telling your dog off because they're afraid. And yes, it is perfectly fine to have your dog sleep on your bed if that's what you would like. It doesn't work for everyone. My dog doesn't sleep on the bed. He sleeps next to the bed. He is only little, but he snores very loudly, and we prefer him to be next to the bed instead. Don't want that snoring right in my ear. But your dog will not come to any harm if they sleep on the bed, or if you let them on the sofa, or if you let them go in front of you on walks. They like to be in front of you on walks, so that's all fine. And I think it's a big relief to a lot of people, because they've been doing these things anyway and feeling guilty about it. There's nothing to feel guilty about at all. It's absolutely fine.
I just love that, because not only have I sometimes felt guilty about it, I sometimes thought, oh, I'm a really lazy dog owner because I'm just so relaxed about this, that, and the other. But I think it really speaks to a deeper understanding of the fact that animals absolutely have emotions. And what are your thoughts about animal behavior in generally, and the understanding now in most people's minds that animals are sentient beings and intelligent? Are you seeing a shift towards a greater understanding of that?
there is a much bigger understanding of that, and it's really good to see. And I think sometimes dog guardians feel, if you tell them scientists used to say that animals didn't experience emotions, they're like, what? This doesn't make sense. But that's been a big shift in recent decades in the science in terms of recognizing that animals are sentient beings, and then that carries through into how we care for them, because we have to take that into account. And that includes things like giving them choices in their life when it's safe to do so, obviously. And it also includes making sure that we give dogs positive experiences. And that actually now has become an important part of thinking about dogs' welfare. All dogs, or whatever pets we happen to have, should be able to have positive experiences. It's not just about preventing cruelty, which is how we used to think about things in the past. And then the thing is, if your dog is fearful, anxious, or reactive, they still need to have those positive experiences, but it can be harder to give them to them because they may be too afraid to take those opportunities, for example. So that's something that you have to think about quite carefully.
And what are the signs that your dog might be fearful or anxious?
A very common one is the tail becoming tucked, and I think that's one that a lot of people know about. But other things can be that the dog's posture becomes lower. Maybe their ears will go back. They may look away from something that they're afraid of, or they may try to move away from something that they're afraid of. But another sign that people often miss is if they lick their lips. Now, if there's a treat coming in, obviously it's like, yum, yum, there's a treat coming. But if it's not in that context, then very likely it's a sign that the dog is feeling anxious or stressed. And we get a few behaviors that we can call displacement behaviors because they're normal behaviors. And sometimes they would happen quite normally, like the dog might be sniffing because there's a great smell. But at other times, they could be sniffing because I like to say it's as if they're saying, I can't see that thing that's over there that's quite stressful. I'll just pretend I'm sniffing over here.
Oh.
And another one is the dog yawning. So people think, oh, the dog is tired, but actually that can be a sign of stress as well. And then, of course, if they're terrified, you get these awful situations where the dog might even pee or poo because they are so, so scared.
Oh, bless them. What about, so one of the things that Compo does is he will sit down and he will just give us a paw and he looks at us with his big brown soulful eyes. What does that mean? Is he just saying, I love you? Or is he
might be.
worried?
He could be worried because that is another behavior that sometimes we see the dog lifting their paw. Maybe not so much giving it to you though. So that suggests that perhaps he's just trying to seek a bit, he could be seeking some comfort, or he could just be saying, I love you. So the context is always important to take into account. But especially with little dogs, they will just lift a paw off the ground as a sign that they are feeling a bit stressed and kind of asking for your help in a way.
Oh, bless them. And so it's okay to comfort a dog and we can ditch the dominance. But what are the problems with some of the dog training methods that listeners should listen out for? Maybe they've got a puppy and they're looking out for puppy training. What are the do's and don'ts in choosing a good dog trainer?
It's really important to look for a trainer who is only going to use what we call reward-based methods. And really that means they're going to be using positive reinforcement, which will most likely be treats. It might sometimes be play or affection, but most often it's going to be treats, especially in a dog training class. So someone who is going to use those methods, and they might be a member of an organisation that is part of the Animal Behaviour and Training Council in the UK, and then you know that they will be using modern reward-based methods, because the risk is that if someone is using those outdated, old-fashioned techniques, that has the potential to cause fear, anxiety, stress, aggression, and a worse relationship with your dog, and even the dog being pessimistic. So those old-fashioned techniques that I'm referring to would be prong collars, yelling at your dog, using what people euphemistically call leash corrections, which are little tugs on the leash. There's a whole host of other methods, and also shock collars, which I think the UK is going to ban at some point, but I don't believe it's happened yet. So that's something we need to actually happen. And I think that's on the table, and there's a lot of support for them to be banned in the UK, which unfortunately is not the case where I live right now in Canada. But there's a lot of research that shows potential harms of using these methods and a lot of benefits from using reward-based training, which of course also then becomes a fun activity for you and your dog, because you ask your dog to do something, they do it, you give them a yummy treat, they're having a lovely time with you. This is what training should be all about. It should be all about fun for both of you.
Absolutely. I mean, forgive me, I just wonder if the reward-based method, which is the only one we should be doing, perhaps is that a slower method than these really cruel, outdated methods of give the dog a shock collar or something. Is it slower, or does it vary from dog to dog? I mean, clearly it's wrong to do the other method, but
Yeah, reward-based methods are actually very, very effective. And some
yeah.
of the research even suggests that they might be more effective than the outdated methods. And in part, that's probably because it's a nice way to motivate the dog. And there is even a piece of research that shows that dogs will run faster to get a piece of sausage compared to kibble. So we know that it really motivates the kind of treat that we use in training can really motivate a dog. And that's probably one of the reasons why reward-based training seems sometimes to be more effective. But that is something that we need a little bit more research on. But I think the other thing is that when people are thinking of using a punishment-based approach, they're thinking of stopping the dog from doing something. They're not thinking about what they would like the dog to do instead. And because a lot of things that we consider behavior issues are actually to do with fear and anxiety. Just stopping the dog from doing something doesn't do anything to address that underlying cause of fear and anxiety. So it doesn't really help the dog from an animal welfare perspective. It's not just that it's causing harm, it's leaving them in this situation where they are fearful or anxious or stressed. So that's another reason why it's so important to stick to a reward-based approach.
Lovely. And talking about rewards, and we've talked about food a lot. So didn't take the advice of one dog expert who came round to see Compo and Barney once, who said it doesn't matter what you give them to eat, providing it's nutritious. Dogs have no idea about what they're eating. I think that's a load of nonsense. Am I right?
Well, I would agree. I think dogs are very, very sensitive to what we give them to eat. They definitely have preferences. So I think every individual dog has a preference. And this is one of the things that I will tell people, for example, if they're teaching a dog to come when called, you have to pay attention to what your dog would like. And an example I like to give is most dogs really, really love cheese and will run really fast to get a piece of cheese. But I have occasionally known a dog who turns their nose up at a piece of cheese. And that's a big surprise when that happens, but it does happen. So you have to take your dog's own individual likes and preferences into account. I mean, every dog has their own personality. That's one of the things that we love about them. But they are very sensitive to the rewards that we give them. And so there are some kinds of situations where you want to make sure you've saved your best rewards for. And so coming when called will be one of those because it's such an important thing. We need sometimes to be able to call dogs back for safety reasons. So we want to make sure they're going to come. So that's when you really want to be using your very best treat.
Well, I must say, a few days ago, I was on a new dog walk with a dear friend of mine, and Sarah, if you're listening. And we were walking our dogs together, and it was somewhere new for both Compo and Barney. And they both went, woohoo! And they ran across this field. They went over the horizon of this, because I live in the countryside. Over the horizon, I couldn't see them, and I was calling them. And it was the first time in ages that they got out of control. And I was laughing because I was talking about this interview that was coming up. And I just had fairly ordinary treats. I mean, I know they weren't fearful. They were with strong sort of play drive. Any tips? What should I have done?
It happens to everybody. And the thing about recall is it's actually quite a hard behavior to teach a really, really good recall because there are all these wonderful things in the environment that dogs might be interested in, like squirrels, like bunny rabbits, like new places to go where they haven't been before. So I think
Dear.
we've all, and deer, yes.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I've had a dog run off after deer before.
Yeah.
That was kind of embarrassing,
Yeah.
but it does happen to everybody. And so the thing about recall is that you need to do a lot of practice. And when you're first teaching it, you need to teach it in a really quiet environment. It could be in your house, in a room in your house, in your garden if you have a garden, and then in places that they know where they're used to walking, where they're completely safe as well, so they can't actually run off and run onto a road or something like that. And then only gradually build up to giving them freedom in these other places. And always have those great treats. And another thing that people often do is that every time they call the dog back, they put the dog on the leash, and that's on the lead, and that's the end of the fun basically for the dog. So also have times when you call them back, they get these wonderful treats, and then they get to go off and have fun again, so that coming back to you doesn't always mean, okay, now I have to get in the car and go home, and that's the end of all the fun. So that's a good thing to remember as well.
Well, when they did come back eventually, when I ran across the field at fast pace, we've got GPS trackers on our dogs, and I found them. I did give them a treat because they did eventually come to me, because I would never punish a dog once I found them, because then they'll think, oh, I'm never going back to you again, ever. So, no, that was good to know that I didn't get that wrong. But what are some of the causes of fear and anxiety in dogs, starting from even gestation?
There are a lot of causes of fear and anxiety, and I like people to know about this because sometimes people feel quite guilty if their dog is fearful or anxious, and it's not your fault, basically, because there's a range of causes and they interact with each other. So, genetics is one cause, and this is why we like to tell people when you get a puppy, try to meet the parents, make sure that both parents are friendly, because that's more likely you've got genetics on your side then. There are stress responses. If the mom is stressed during pregnancy, that can cause stress hormones to circulate. That can perhaps lead to increased fear and anxiety. Early experiences in the nest. And then the most important thing that we can do something about is during that sensitive period for socialization, which is from 3 until about 12 to 14 weeks. And we need to give puppies a wide range of positive experiences during that time. And we call it socialization. And some of that will happen at the breeder, and then some of that obviously is our responsibility when they come to live with us. If they have a wide range of positive experiences during that time, they're more likely to grow up to be friendly, confident, happy adult dogs. So that's really, really important. And one of the things in the pandemic is that people just weren't able to do that, and that's been unfortunate. But those aren't the only causes. So it's possible for a dog to have a bad experience, and that just sets them off and makes them afraid of something. And also, these days, we increasingly know that pain and other medical issues can contribute to fear and anxiety as well. So if you have a new fear and anxiety developing in an older dog, or any sudden behaviour change in an older dog, you need to see your veterinarian just in case there's something medical going on.
Well, several things to say about that. First of all, last week, Noel took Barney to go and see a new puppy, Luca, who was being socialized, and they just had a ball. They had a really great time. But these COVID dogs, I mean, certainly in the UK, I know you're in Canada now, but it was a real thing that people were rushing out to get a dog for the first time because they were here in extended lockdowns, and there were COVID puppies and rescue dogs. And I feel for those dogs. It is a real problem where mum and dad, as I want to call them, had to go back out to work afterwards, and the dogs sort of left alone. So have you seen a lot of sort of separation anxiety where the dog has learnt that it's in a family unit and suddenly it's left alone for a long time? And if so, have you been able to help dog guardians with that situation?
Yeah, I think the pandemic did cause quite a few issues, unfortunately, because people just couldn't socialize their puppies when they needed to. And then they would spend all the time because they couldn't go out. So they would be there all the time and then all of a sudden go back to work. And that's a big change for dogs. And there is now some research coming out of the Royal Veterinary College that shows that this is a real thing that happened, and it has had consequences for dogs, unfortunately. And one of the things I always advise people whenever there's a change in routine is to do what you can to keep the bits of the routine that are important to your dog the same as far as possible, because that can help them to adjust. So even if you're now going out, if you can still manage to feed them at the same times and take them for walks at the same times of day, that's very helpful for them. But separation related issues can be a real problem, and we do have some evidence that they've increased as a result of the pandemic, and that is probably one of the most difficult things to deal with. It's important to note that it's not necessarily just being left alone, that sometimes dogs will cause damage in the house or appear to have separation related issues simply because they're bored or something like that. So I think it's a good idea to get a dog trainer or behaviourist, clinical animal behaviourist, to come and help you in those circumstances, because it's very hard for someone to deal with on their own, and it's much better to have help. And also speak to your veterinarian about that as well, because very often the vets that I work with will want to prescribe some medication that can help with that as well.
So going back to the person who's listening to this, and they've recently had a change in circumstance where their dog is left alone more, what are the practical things that they can do? I mean, presumably a dog walk is a good idea, is it? Somebody you can trust to come into your house. I mean, Noel and I, we're very lucky because Noel's around a lot of the time and the dogs are rarely left alone. But occasionally we do go out together. We go out for lunch or to the evening. I put on dog TV on YouTube. Is that just a load of nonsense?
I think some dogs like it. So every dog is different. So for some dogs, if they're really attached to their person so strongly that they can't be left alone, then it wouldn't help. But for a lot of dogs, it would help, who don't have a big separation related problem. It probably would help because there's something for them to look at, something sounds for them to listen to as well. But I think, yes, if you have to leave your dog home alone for longer than you would like, it can help to have a dog walker to come in, or someone just to come in and sit with the dog. And maybe you have a friend or a family member who would like to have a dog but can't, and they can be like the dog's auntie or uncle and come and spend time with the dog sometimes, and that can work well, because there are a lot of people who would like dogs but know that they can't get one because the hours that they work or the expense or whatever. So that can be helpful. There are some dog daycares that are quite good. You have to vet dog daycares and make certain they're sticking to reward-based methods. But there are some that can be quite good as well. And also just making sure that your dog does have plenty of activities to do, so that they're not bored all day, then left home alone, and then bored all evening as well, so that they do get their exercise and they do have enrichment activities to do, and they do get opportunities to use their nose and so on. So that can help too.
Oh, that's really, really good advice. And I know also that when we go out, Noel goes and has a chat with Compo and tells him, we're going to go out now. We're not going to be very long. Then Compo tells Barney. And whereas I have been told by the dog trainer who says everything they eat tastes like cardboard, to just go. So I've changed my behaviour to sort of say, because I go out a lot for work or whatever, and I now say goodbye to them. And there are sort of like puzzle toys you can buy, aren't there? Sort of food puzzle toys, that sort of thing. The other thing I picked out of that, which slightly concerns us, is our 6-year-old dog Compo golden retriever has elbow dysplasia, and he had surgery when he was just over 1 year old with actually the super vet, Knowles Fitzpatrick in the UK. And he's been brilliant. He's on something called Librela, and he lives a really great life, but we're careful with managing how much he walks. But we've noticed in the last year that he's become more fearful in some sort of in the evening if he's on his dog bed and we're all in there as a family reading or listening or watching something, and then some small noise and he'll just go, oh, and he'll be totally startled. And I just wonder if that's like underlying pain again in the elbows. So it might be something to look into. Is that the sort of thing you should get checked out with the vet?
Yeah, so it's important to say that I'm not a veterinarian,
No.
but I spoke to a number of vets when writing the book, and they did tell me that if an older dog is developing a fear of noises, that is something that is worth getting checked with the vet. And in particular, I spoke to Professor Daniel Mills at the University of Lincoln, and he said that very often vets will do a trial of painkillers to see if it helps. So that's something to discuss with your vet. And then just going back to what you said a moment before that about this outdated idea of ignoring dogs when you go out, that fits in with those ideas we discussed at the beginning of the show, that really there are some things that we used to say and everybody used to believe them, and now we know that it's not relevant anymore. It's perfectly okay to say goodbye to your dog and make a big fuss of your dog when you come home. And there isn't actually specifically much research on that. There is one study, but it was only very small, and it suggested that that's absolutely fine to do. But we would expect it to be fine to do as well when you think of it in terms of an attachment relationship. And the same way you wouldn't come home and ignore your child, so in the same way you wouldn't come home and ignore your dog. It feels very hard for us to ignore them in those circumstances. Again, it's perfectly okay to greet your dog, to make a fuss of them, and to say goodbye to them before you go out as well.
You know what? A lot of this is just, intuitively, don't you? That you love your dog or your cat or whatever. And of course, you want to greet them. And of course, you want to say goodbye and give them a cuddle on the sofa and all of those things. It's like Mother Nature, isn't it? It's just how we would treat anybody that we love. And I'm really sad that for so long we've been taught something different in the name of dominance, which is probably an outdated notion, really, where we think, I don't expect you to comment on this, but where the older doctrines were, we're the head of the animal kingdom. Yes, I'm pleased to see that change. But you spoke about medication, and I was really interested in the book to read about anxiety reducing medication in dogs. Tell us about the pros and cons of that.
Yeah, so again, with the proviso that I'm not a veterinarian, so
Yes.
I can't make specific recommendations on that. But one thing we know now is that veterinarians quite often will prescribe psychoactive medications to dogs, and my own dog actually is on fluoxetine, Prozac, to help with some of his older dog issues. And so it's very common, and I think it helps people to know that vets can prescribe medication that will help in the short term. Like if Guy Fawkes Night is coming up and you're worried about your dog and the sounds of the fireworks. And also they can prescribe medication that works in the long term too. And I spoke to veterinary behaviourist Dr. Claudia Richter for the book. And she told me the way that she likes to talk about it, because a lot of people worry about giving medication to their dog and they worry that it might change the dog's personality. And she said that's not what it's meant to do at all. And she prefers to think of it as it taking that anxiety away so that you can actually see more of your dog's personality. And so if that's something that your veterinarian recommends, well, I'm in favour of following what your vet says, basically. But a lot of dog trainers these days will suggest to someone that perhaps they should see their vet in case the vet wants to prescribe those medications. And when you have a dog who is very fearful or very anxious, and a situation where it's difficult to take them away from the things that they're afraid of, sometimes I've seen that the medication can make it much easier to do the training. So, for example, if there's a loud noise and you're giving treats to your dog, but the dog is really, really scared, they might not feel up to taking those treats. But if the vet has prescribed medication, then that training might actually work much better because it will just bring the levels down such that they do feel able to take the treats. So it's not something to use instead of behaviour modification and training. It's something that you can do as well if that's what your vet recommends.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, I'm going to speak about me as a person. So, in my past, I've had a lot of anxiety and panic, and I've had bouts of depression. I mean, the last 10 years have been the best years of my life. But even so, I still have bouts of anxiety. And you know yourself when you go through that. I mean, generally, I'm not talking about you, Zazie, I'm not being personal, but I know myself when I feel like that, it's hard to be rational. I might not eat as much. I certainly won't sleep as well. I certainly can't have any reasoning, and there's nothing funny. I can't make a joke. I can't smile. I can't be kind. I can't be helpful because you're just locked in that prism of intense emotion. And you see that with dogs. And, you know, we can listen to podcasts, we can read about it, which is how I've managed my own sort of anxiety and fears is through self-learning, talking to others, having some therapy. And we don't yet know, but it's unlikely that dogs can talk to each other about anxiety. I mean, I'm not going to make any presumptions. So it's really up to us as guardians to sort of to do everything we can to support them in those situations.
It is. And the most important thing that we can do is to try and help them to feel safe and to think about what that looks like for that dog and the things that they're afraid of, because that's going to be different for every dog. I mean, if they're afraid of new people who they haven't met before, then it's relatively easy most of the time to keep people at a distance so that they don't actually have to meet anyone, and then you can keep them safe that way while you work on the training. But in other circumstances, like if it's loud noises and Guy Fawkes is coming up, it's very hard you can't prevent them from hearing fireworks. So, bonfire night is just very loud and the night's either side of it. So that's when it's really helpful to think about, can your vet help and would your vet like to help? to suggest anything to help with that.
And you also talk about certain types of reward training in the book. Let's take firework night as an example. Tell us about some of the methods you use for, say, loud noises, bear bangs, you call them, or something in Canada. Have I got that right?
So bear bangers sound kind of like a firework that goes off. It's like two bangs, one after the other, and people put them out because if there are black bears in the garden. So where I live, we get a few black bears. We don't see them very often. Some summers we see them more often than others, and that's why there's a story in the book that relates to bear bangers. So people will put them to try and frighten the bears away, because if the bears get used to being around humans, and especially if they get used to food sources around humans, unfortunately that means that ultimately the bear is going to get shot and killed because they're not safe to be around people. So it's really important for people to be bear aware and, to lock their rubbish up, for example. But also some people like to use bear bangers to make the bears go away. So that's a big loud bang when you're not expecting it. And if you're outside, you also are hoping that it's not sending the bear running in your direction. But yeah, so that's a loud bang. So to your question, one of the best ways to deal with loud noises is through this approach that we call counter conditioning. And you can use this for anything that a dog is afraid of. And basically what it means is that if anything happens that the dog considers scary, you're going to give them the ultimate snack, which might be a piece of unexpected steak or an unanticipated sardine or something like that. Something really, really yummy for the dog. And this is actually a very effective technique, although if your dog has like a fear that's been lasting for a long time, it will take time to resolve. And ideally, you would do this at the same time as what we call desensitization. So ideally, you might get fireworks noises and play them super, super quietly, really, really quietly at a level where the dog is quite, quite happy, not stressed at all, really happy, not bothered by these sounds. And each time there's a sound, you give them that piece of steak or sausage or sardine or cheese or whatever your dog loves. And then over time, you will be able to increase the volume and keep still at a level where the dog is happy and keep feeding. And eventually they will become okay with these loud noises. But it's not always possible to prevent loud noises happening outside of your training session, like bear bangers here or fireworks on bonfire night. And so each time there is a loud noise, you would give that treat anyway. And in this case, we would call it ad hoc counter conditioning because it's not part of a planned training schedule, but it's just that the bad noise happened from the dog's perspective. So we have to give them something really lovely. And so some dogs will be too afraid to take the treat to begin with, but it's still really important to offer it. Even though they're not going to take it, you still offer it. They will notice that it's offered. And over time, hopefully they will begin to take it. And I've got a story about my late dog Bodger and the bear bangers in the book, so people can see an example of that in action if they want.
I love the fact in the book you talk about your own dogs as well and the little stories, and it's just such a great read. It's so beautifully and clearly written. So thank you for that. But going back to some other sort of common fears, now, what about new people coming to the house? What would be a really neat way to manage that if your dog is frightened? I've got the opposite problem with our dogs. But how should people manage that practically?
Yes, if the dog is afraid of new people coming into the home, well, one thing to consider, is there actually a risk of someone getting bitten? Because if there is, you really have to be very careful with the management. And I would recommend that you hire a good dog trainer to help you with that, because you don't want to take any risks. But let's assume that it's a milder fear than that. You still don't want to put your dog in a situation where they are forced to meet someone and they're afraid. So you could just simply choose to put your dog in another room and they never get to meet the person coming to the home. That would be a management solution. That's okay. Or they could be behind a pet gate, for example. But the other thing is that you can use treats in those situations, really good treats, to help to teach the dog that actually new people are great, because then I get all these lovely treats. And the best thing is to make sure that you or your dog trainer are the one giving the treats, because if you ask the new person coming into the home to give the treat, then the dog has to go up to someone they're afraid of in order to get the treat. And you want to keep them really comfortable. You don't want to put them in a situation where they're feeling nervous or stressed. So I think a lot of people jump to that point and they know that treats can be involved and they ask the new person to do it. Keep the new person at a distance. Keep your dog at a safe distance. Use a lead to keep them away or have them on the other side of a pet gate, and have you or your dog trainer be the person feeding the treats. And then do that with multiple people, and then gradually over time, hopefully they will get much, much better and happier about meeting new people. That's the general principle.
Well, I can tell you, we've got some dear friends who listen to the show actually, and they've got a dog who's a bit fearful. We went there for dinner on Saturday night, and they're such good dog guardians. I mean, they've studied it, although they're tree folk, and the dog, beautiful, beautiful Australian Shepherd. Oh, I can't remember what he is. We just blanked that bit out. Beautiful dog, and they just kept him in the living room until we'd been there about half an hour. He barked a bit at the beginning, and then when the dog guardian felt that he was ready, he came out and then he sniffed around. We were told to ignore him and stand still, and he sniffed around us. And by the end of the evening, I was stroking his ears, stroking his head. He was coming up to me, and it was a really joyful experience. But I didn't give him a treat. But that was a really good example. So our situation, which I know isn't the subject of this particular book, but you've written others. So we've got the 2 golden retrievers. Somebody comes to the door and they're big. I mean, Compo is 40 kilograms. And it's like, yeah, it's new people. Hello, hello, hello. Love me, love me, love me, love me. And Barney's going, oh, I really love it. I really love it. And Compo doesn't jump up, but he's like all over them. And people find it intimidating. And I'm holding back Barney just to stop them from being like knocked over on the front. And then I take them into the garden and I do scatter feeding on the lawn. What am I doing wrong? What can we do about it? It puts people off coming round.
Well, it's a wonderful problem to have because it's so great to have such friendly dogs. I want to come round now because I would love it. But I get that it's not for everybody.
No.
And really the thing is to think about what would you like them to do in those circumstances. I mean, they're not jumping already. That's amazing that you've trained them not to jump, because a lot of people find it quite hard to teach the dogs just to keep forepaws on the floor. But that's often enough for a lot of people. So if there's something else that you would like them to do instead, you can think about that, because you might want to make them sit and keep still that way, for example. And you could train them to do that if you wanted. I think when you have an excitable dog, like so happy and friendly to meet people like this, it can take a little while in the early stages of the training, because it can be quite hard for them to stay in a sit. Like, it takes a lot of concentration, and they might only stay in a sit for a second to begin with, or a fraction of a second to begin with. But that's one option that you could teach if you wanted. I love that you do the scatter feeding. I think that's a wonderful thing to do for any dog. It's a great enrichment activity. And also, I love the story about your friends and what they did with their dog, because that's lovely. The dog was not forced to come and meet you right away. They had time to sniff you through the door, to hear you through the door. They came in. You were not applying any pressure to the dog, because you just ignored the dog and the dog could come up to you when they wanted. That's beautiful. That's really lovely. And it's so important to give dogs choices like that. So actually, in both of these situations, you're giving dogs choices of how they want to greet. And I think it's just a case for you of thinking, what would you like them to do instead? If you think it is too much happy friendly golden retriever for people, too much happy dog, what would you like them to do? And very often people would pick a short sit stay at that point, for example. And that's very easy to train.
It's mainly the barking actually with Compo. It's almost like barking Tourette's, but it always dies down after about 5 minutes. But hey, no, that's really, really good advice. But some poor dogs, they get themselves in a terrible tiswas. Maybe they've had a terrible life before they come in the dog guardian's ownership. And there is this thing like tail chasing, isn't there? And other sort of what we would call obsessive compulsive behaviours. What did you learn about these behaviours and how they could be treated for your research?
Yeah, I looked into these for the book because they can sometimes be quite problematic for people, but also often they're indicating an issue with the dog's welfare. And I should say that, I mean, when I adopted my own dog, Bodger, a long, long time ago now, he would chase his tail and spin in circles, and it was quite hard to see, but he had come from a difficult situation beforehand. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the dog is in a bad situation now. If you're seeing it in a dog that
Yeah.
you've adopted, it may just reflect what's happened in their past. And I think this is something to always take to your veterinarian. And the other interesting thing that I found was that increasingly there are being medical issues found that contribute to these things as well. So that's another reason. And
Right.
again, I'm not a vet, but these are things that you should see your veterinarian about and get their advice on, because they will be able to determine if it's medical or not. But the other thing is sometimes you
Mm.
have to wait to see a specialist. And so in that case, because stress might be part of it, it's important to reduce stress as much as possible for your dog. And those are things that are good for any dog to do, but they're especially good for a dog with some kind of anxiety issues or fear issues. So giving them choices, giving them a safe space in the home that they can go to, keeping a routine for them, not forcing them to do anything. So not forcing them to be petted, for example, and giving them lots of enrichment activities, which might be walks, it might be scatter feeding, it could be food puzzle toys, it could be doing some tricks training or something like that. And that can be very helpful too.
Yeah, that's great advice. And even since reading your book, I've been much more in tune. I mean, Compo is a really sensitive one, the deep one, and really more in tune with, does he want to be petted now or not? And then you get a sense of when he doesn't want it anymore. Barney is the younger dog. He's a working golden. We don't work him, but that's the type of golden he is. And he's very possessive over me. If I'm petting Compo, then Barney's coming in between and sort of guarding because he needs that. He's slightly more insecure and on edge. And so Barney is like my dog and Compo is like, no. It's just hilarious. But you also spoke about routine, and I think isn't it wonderful that dogs have this internal clock?
I love it.
So
And
do I.
it can be so helpful sometimes because there's no danger of forgetting that it's time to take your dog for a walk because they will
No,
come and remind you. And
yeah,
I love that. And I love it especially because it shows you that they're anticipating what is going to happen. Whether it is their training session or a walk or their food, because it's their mealtime or something, it shows
yeah,
you that they're looking forward to it. And that's really nice.
yeah,
Yeah, they
that's
have
so
such good
true.
clocks.
They really do. We don't need an alarm clock because we have compost bark, normally about 6:15. And then I tend to work late well, sort of till about 7. And then Barney's under the desk really patiently. And the minute I get up, he's like, it's ball time, it's ball time. And I feel really bad if I'm going out to yoga or something. It's time to play ball. But I really, really love that. And it shows this great intelligence, as you say, this potential to look forward to something, to remember something, to create their dog memories. And you see that in their dreams as well, don't you? With the sort of moving and everything like that. They really are wonderful. May I ask you a listener's question? So we always go to our listeners. So normally it's a tree community, but I've got a great question here from Naomi Searcher, originally from the States and now in Switzerland. And I love this. What is it that the dogs sense? We know that our emotions elicit chemical reactions. Do they have an odor or something they can sense? Do our emotions or state of mind give off vibes that they pick up on? What did you find during your scientific learning?
That's a really great question, and
It
I think
is.
people often want to know, can their dog tell what they're feeling? And yes, dogs are actually really in tune with us. They seem to be able to tell what kinds of emotions we're feeling. So, for example, if someone is crying, they may want to go and comfort them. That's been tested in a study where someone pretended to cry to see what the dog would do. Yes, the dog would come, and they can tell the difference between being happy or being angry, for example. So they're very, very good at reading our body language. We're perhaps not quite so good at reading theirs. But it does seem also that there is something going on with scent that they can
Yeah.
smell. So there is some research where dogs were tested to see if they could tell the difference between it was the armpit odor of someone who is stressed and someone who's not. And they do seem to be able to smell something there as well. So I think this is partly why they're just so amazingly in tune to us and why they make such wonderful companions for us, because they do seem to know how we're feeling. And I think that's just amazing.
It's amazing, but you know what? It makes sense in terms of evolution, doesn't it? Because we've all evolved to survive. And so a dog being so in tune with other animals and human sense due to hormonal changes, due to mood, they're going to have to learn that. They're going to have to learn to keep away from the angry people and go towards the happy people. So I think there's like a scientific, personally, this is my own unscientific research, that it just kind of makes sense that they do. And certainly that's absolutely my experience.
We can just take that back to training methods for a minute,
Yeah.
because if you think of those outdated ideas of being dominant or the pack leader and shouting at your dog, they know you're angry. They don't
Mm.
want to come to you when you're angry. And whereas if we're using reward-based training methods, we're happy, they're happy, we're all having a lovely time together. They can tell the emotions that go with that too. So yeah, it's one of those other reasons why it's so important to stick to the reward-based methods.
Absolutely. And in my own experience, I don't know what you found during your scientific research, but certainly my dogs, well, particularly Compo, knows when Noel is on his way home. And it normally gets to about a 5 mile radius. So, for example, today Noel went to get one of the cars MOT'd. We have a location sharing app. And so I thought, and I noticed Compo's behaviour change in that he moved on the patio and looked towards the open gates for the drive. There's a barrier in between. And I thought, oh, I bet Noel's about 5 miles away, and he was. And this might be woo-woo, and I know you can only speak to the science that you've researched. Have you found any scientific studies that show some kind of brainwave connection between very attached dogs and their owners? Or is that nonsense scientifically?
I think we would need more research on that.
That's a
So
very good answer.
this is not something that I studied for the book. I know there is one piece of research, and the name has gone out of my head, unfortunately. I know that Mark Beckhoff was one of the reviewers because he was telling me about it recently, and he didn't find anything scientifically wrong with the study. So, but it was only one study. We always need multiple studies. So we
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, I think we would like to imagine it. The other thing is that dogs have amazing hearing as well as their sense of smell. So I like to think that when I'm driving up the street from a mile away, perhaps my dog can already hear my car coming and distinguish between my car and other people's cars. So maybe he knows. And this is going to sound a bit silly, but when we had our dog Bodger, when we had a few times when we had to be out for longer than usual, I would actually ring and speak to him on the answer phone and tell him that I was
Yeah.
coming home. And I would say soon. And I felt that he knew what soon meant. So when we got to like fairly close to home, I would tell him we will be home soon. And it made a big difference actually to how he was when we came home. I felt like he had understood. And of course, that's only my feeling. And I haven't done a scientific study of what he understood by the word soon. But he was a very clever dog. So who knows? And I felt that it helped. So
Well, I love that. What a great idea. I mean, we don't have an answer phone anymore because it's all mobiles, but what a lovely idea. And I love the fact that we've got so much more to learn. I mean, I really enjoyed a book that was an exploration of animal science called An Immense World by Ed Yong. And I know we're not here to talk about this book, but I sort of refreshed it a little bit for this interview. And what I'm struck by this book and other animal scientists, he's not an animal scientist, he reviewed others, is there's so much more to learn. And what excites you, Zazie, about new science with companion animals and new areas
well,
of research?
I love Ed Yong's book too, and I love the way it has so much in there about animals that I had no idea of. And I
Yeah.
think this is just so interesting. And the thing is that we didn't used to talk about pet dogs and pet cats in science going back like 20 years. And it's something that's relatively new, and it's so relevant to our everyday lives with dogs. And there is always something new to learn, and that just keeps me absolutely fascinated all the time. So personally, I love just watching the body language of my pets or interactions between dogs and people, for example. That in itself is really fascinating. And I think we're just learning so much more. And I get really excited by some of the studies, and especially when they're going to be helpful to people. So they're not just theoretical. The theories are really interesting too, but when they have some kind of practical relevance to our everyday lives with dogs, that's when I get really excited, especially when we're thinking about dogs as sentient beings who have needs that we have to meet. And I think that's been such a positive change in how we think about animals, and not just dogs, but other animals as well, wild animals too, and farmed animals and so on. So I hope that things will just continue in that way, and we'll just keep on learning more and be able to apply it and use it. And it will help us too, because when we understand our dogs, you know, it helps make us happier as well. So yeah, I just find it all absolutely fascinating.
I love that. So to sum up, the person who's trying everything or they're a bit baffled, what top tips can you give the exhausted dog guardian who has got a fearful and anxious dog in a nutshell?
I would say anytime you're struggling, seek help from a reward-based trainer or a clinical animal behaviorist or your veterinarian, because there is so much that we can do that will help. And sometimes it comes down to little technical things that you on your own are going to find quite difficult to discover, but someone else will just be able to point you in the right direction, and all of a sudden it will make a big difference. So for example, sometimes people think they're trying counter conditioning and it's not quite working. A good trainer will be able to help you improve your technique and make a much bigger difference. So get help. There is hope. We can't necessarily fix everything, but there is a huge lot that can be done to make the situation better.
Thank you. Well, Zazie Todd, your book, Bark, brought me a lot of comfort, practical advice, and I just want to thank you for just showing that loving kindness towards our dogs is a way forward for a great relationship, and it's really effective. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been my pleasure.